About half of all Americans have smoked marijuana at some point in their lives. Today it's still technically illegal at the federal level, but it's not enforced, and most states have passed their own laws to decriminalize, and in some cases even legalize it. You don't even need to smoke it anymore to get high. You can just buy fancy weed-infused drinks, food, and candies that are specifically formulated to control the intensity of your high. But that's a very recent development. For anyone using marijuana just a few years ago before weed shops became a thing, the two ways to get high were to either experiment with homemade cooking or simply just smoke it, which was what most people chose, and the majority of users were at the end of a long supply chain that they thought nothing about. Unless you were really high and bored, you probably never thought of where this weed might have been grown and how it got to your pipe. And if you were smoking weed in the 1970s, then there is a good chance that your stuff passed through a smuggler named Jimmy Chagra. This man created a logistical network that brought weed from Central and South America directly from the farmer to distributors in the United States. The amount of wealth that passed through Jimmy Chagra's hands can never be accurately calculated, but some say that he probably made $100 million during his decade-long career. Then again, he probably never really knew exactly how much money he made either, because as you are going to find out, Jimmy Chagra wasn't addicted to greed, he was addicted to action. And his tale tells the story of a man who was briefly at the top of his drug game before it all came crashing down, climaxing with the notorious murder of a federal judge. And from there, it only got worse. Here is the story of Jimmy Chagra. From the outside, it must have looked like Abdu and Jaspahin Chagra had achieved the American dream. For these immigrants from Lebanon who relocated to Texas, they had a thriving rug merchant business, and 2 of their 4 children had become successful lawyers. They had 3 sons and 1 daughter, where Jamiel, who went by Jimmy, was the middle child as well as the black sheep from his parents' perspective. Jimmy was born on December 7, 1944 in El Paso, where he was also raised. While his brothers Lee and Joe had good grades and went off to college, education did not agree with Jimmy. Plus, he had married young and began having children before having career prospects. So his parents tried to bring him into the family business that they built through long working days over the years. And he was a disaster. He had zero passion for the family trade along with no sense of responsibility to be diligent and protect what his parents created. In the end, he was nothing short of a failure, and he almost bankrupted them. The details of what happened after that are not entirely clear. But Jimmy has been described as charming, so whatever stress he caused his family seems to have been forgiven. We know that later in his life he was addicted to cocaine, so it's not too much of a stretch to believe that before that, he was into smoking weed. Marijuana is a low-margin drug towards the end of the distribution spectrum, so it's possible that like many low-level drug dealers that sold weed, he probably started doing it because he saw it as a way to smoke for free. His older brother Lee, a criminal defense lawyer, was said to be corrupt, and it's very possible that he introduced his younger brother to other criminals after recognizing that Jimmy shared characteristics with these people. Regardless of how it exactly began, in the late 60s, people started to notice that he was dressing nice and had a lot of cash despite not having a visible job. And being a charming guy from El Paso, which is on the Mexican border across from Juarez, put him in a position that would be the foundation for his drug empire. Marijuana is a weed that can grow almost anywhere, but what gets you high is a chemical in it called THC. In the 1960s, when it first became popular in the counterculture, the only weed grown in America with enough THC to create a buzz came from California. This was the days before botanists created the new strains we have today that are way more potent than what the original hippies in San Francisco were smoking. Anything grown anywhere else couldn't really get you high, but it could land you in prison if you were caught with it. But one place with better weed than California during those days was south of the border in Mexico. And with Jimmy being a homegrown El Paso boy, he had connections at the border that allowed him to smuggle weed into Texas. According to people that were smugglers at the time, it was fairly easy to get things across the border as it was wide. Border Patrol was understaffed, and they were mainly focused on stopping illegal immigration, which made searching Americans not a high priority. When the DEA was formed to combat drug trafficking, They found it difficult to stop it at the border. Instead, they opted to create random checkpoints on the roads that were within 200 miles of the crossings. The American Southwest is huge and empty with only a few roads, which makes them choke points for travelers. The guy waving you through the border might be nice and allow you into the country without an issue, but 100 miles down the road could be another story. This was a problem for the smugglers, but a friend of Chagra's named Pete Krachowski, who did 2 tours in Vietnam as a helicopter pilot, went to his buddy with a business proposal. Pete would borrow a private plane, and Jimmy would use his Mexican connections to get 700 pounds of weed for which a buyer was already lined up. By using an aircraft, they could fly over the checkpoints into the interior of the country for a direct delivery. For this first run, they got the weed and flew into Colorado, where they delivered it to what's been described as trust fund hippies for $85,000. The money that they made from the deal paid for the plane, and it was the seed money that built Jimmy Chagra's drug empire. With each run, he grew bolder, and the financial reward increased. During the early 1970s, his fortune grew, and he invested in a fleet of 6 airplanes and 4 large ships for the bulk transport of marijuana. He also had a huge payroll that was far beyond his smugglers. He had a network of corrupt DEA and border agents making sure his products got through without any issues. He later claimed that he even had the Prime Minister of the Bahamas in his pocket, so his boats could freely move through their waters without any fear. As the decade went on, Mexican marijuana began to lose its market appeal, mainly because the farmers did not rotate their crops as they were planting everywhere for maximum quantity and revenue. This caused the soil quality to decline, which then led to the plants producing less THC. At the same time, the Colombians began to become skilled in processing cocaine, and some entrepreneurs transferred those skills into cultivating more potent marijuana plants. And so in America, the end users of these drugs wanted the good Colombian stuff. Despite Jimmy's vast personal network, he did not know any Colombians and couldn't find anyone who could make an introduction. But this man was bold, and he spoke fluent Spanish, while also looking like he could pass for a local. So he got on a plane and flew down there. He didn't know where to go, so he asked around, worked his charm, and eventually got connected with the right people. Now Jimmy Chagra was one of the very few people in America with a direct connection to Colombian weed. This made his market share of the marijuana business explode. Jimmy Chagra was at the top, and he still had a long way to rise, which would turn him into a legend. Now all of the massive amounts of money he was making were illegal, and he couldn't claim it like it was on his tax return without admitting to a crime. He needed to launder it to make it look legitimate. So Jimmy Chagra found a partner with the Las Vegas casinos. The setup was simple. Jimmy would bring his dirty cash to the casino, they would take a small cut of it and then give him new cash, which would be declared as gambling winnings. They did this for 2 reasons. The first was greed, but the second was that Jimmy Chagra was one of their biggest customers. Jimmy Chagra was a bold man who took a lot of risks. It wasn't because he was addicted to the money, instead he was addicted to the thrill of taking a risk and getting a payoff. This made him a successful drug trafficker in the pioneer days of that industry, but it also made him a degenerate gambler. By all accounts, Chagra, and his brothers too, had gambling problems before they became big, but their tolerance for risk transferred into the empire they built. And once they were successful, they had more money rolling in than they needed or could spend. And with all the cash, Chagra became a big man in Vegas, which caused people to start to notice him. Not an ideal spot to be in, as running a criminal enterprise is best done from the shadows. He would regularly make $10,000 bets at the craps table, and had no problem losing until he won something. $10,000 in 1973 is about $75,000 today, so that's the average American's yearly salary. Casinos are set up in a way so that the house almost always wins, and they like to comp their high rollers with free rooms and meals to make them feel better about losing, so they keep gambling. A free hotel room at a casino is going to cost a lot more indirectly to you, because it means you lost a lot of money. For Jimmy Chagra, he would be comped with the famous Frank Sinatra suite, which was the best hotel space you could get in that city. Some even say that he was such a big customer to the casino that when Frank Sinatra traveled to Las Vegas and Jimmy Chagra would be already booked in his suite, it was the famous singer that needed to be put in a different room. Eventually, Chagra ended up buying a $1 million mansion in the desert city, which today would be worth $7.5 million. But he didn't care about losing money when he gambled because he had so much cash coming in. And his position as a man with a logistical empire and Colombian drug connections made him a very important man in his trade. Now, despite all the money we was making, Jimmy Chagra's gambling addiction caused problems in his marriage, and in 1973, his wife divorced him. They had 3 daughters. Other women would enter his life and he would marry and divorce again in just a couple years. But by this point, he could have retired and lived very comfortably off the money he made, and he would have been smart to get out of the game. The federal government declared a war on drugs in 1971, and after a few years, they knew they were losing. As part of a new strategy, laws were passed imposing draconian sentencing penalties for drug traffickers, dealers, and users if they were caught in possession. But Jimmy Chagra stayed in the game because the excitement was what was most important to him. In 1975, Chagra ended up teaming up with 2 marijuana traffickers named Jack Strickland and Mike Halliday. These 2 men had a very well-oiled machine when it came to smuggling and distributing pot. Mike Halliday ran the Mexican side of the operation, where he cultivated relationships with farmers and organized the smuggling of the plants into the United States. Jack Strickland would receive them and then use trucks to distribute the weed to his network of distributors across the country. Things were going great for the 2 men, and they had a loyal crew plus contacts in law enforcement who would look the other way usually, and when they had to do their jobs, they would do very half-assed investigations that never amounted to anything. Strickland was based in El Paso and drove a Jaguar while his front business was a bar. One day, a senior DEA official he was friendly with came in for a beer, and as they chatted, the agent asked him to stop driving so fast because he was worried the agents who were tasked to follow him might get into an accident. But the market started to change as the quality of Mexican weed went down and the better Colombian stuff became available. Strickland started to hear from his distributor customers that the Mexican stuff would take months to sell because it was now considered swag. To continue their business, they needed Colombian weed, so the 2 men, both from El Paso, got together with their fellow hometown native Jimmy Chagra to expand their partnership. They brought a vast domestic distribution network, while Jimmy brought the Colombian contacts and the transportation between that country and the United States. During the summer of 1975, the new partnership embarked on what was then the smuggling of the largest amount of pot to ever enter the United States, 58,000 pounds, more than 27 tons of the plant. The strategy for this audacious plan was simple. At this point, the DEA identified Florida as ground zero for drug smuggling, and the federal government increased the amount of Coast Guard in the waters. So instead, the group decided to bypass the southern Atlantic coast, and instead decided to bring this massive amount of weed through Folly Cove in Massachusetts. To do this, Jimmy made a deal with New England's leading mafia family to pay them for using their territory and to have their protection from local law enforcement. Once that was secured, a rusty shrimp boat was loaded in South America, and then it made the long trek to the northern United States during the start of hurricane season. Once it was outside of Folly Cove, it acted as a mothership, and a variety of boats would come to it, take a load, and then bring the weed back to the shore. The weed was packed and wrapped with plastic into large bales that were moved from the larger boat into the smaller ones by hand. The boats would return for more, while trucks on land would transport the weed to 2 stash houses. Once the weed was at the stash house, someone had to stay with it to open the packages, spread the buds out, and constantly stir them. It needed to be exposed regularly to air, otherwise it could become moldy and unsellable. This operation could only be done at night, and it took 3 days. But with the sale of the weed from the first installment, the costs for this operation were covered, and the rest was all profit that added up to be in the millions. It made all 3 participants legends in the underworld, which was a bad thing in the long run, because that put a target on their back for the government to take them down, as they were now considered high profile. "1976 was a pivotal year for Jimmy Chagra, as he branched out into smuggling cocaine for his Colombian contacts. As a product, it had a much greater wealth density than marijuana, which meant that a plane full of coke was much more valuable than a plane full of weed. So this rich and oftentimes out of control man ended up getting a hell of a lot richer, but even more significant was that he began getting high off his own supply. A coked-out Jimmy Chagra was a lot more reckless than stoned Jimmy Chagra. There is a story about him that once he was flying around in the Caribbean Sea where he noticed a stalled-out freighter ship. Suspecting that it might have been smuggling something, he somehow landed and got on board it. His hunch was right that they were smugglers, and that they were disabled. The captain and crew were nervous that the U.S. Coast Guard or some other authorities would stumble upon their cargo and arrest them. So Jimmy negotiated a deal where he would send people to unload the ship, and then he would later send payment to the owner of the goods. An agreement was made, Jimmy left, and a couple hours later, his crew came to take possession. After that, he made sure the rightful owner was paid. It takes someone with huge balls to set up a deal like that cold, because it could have been a law enforcement trap, or the people on board could have killed him instead if they felt nervous that he was an undercover. That situation paid off, but actions like that made a lot of people nervous. Kim Schwiedel, who worked as part of Jack Strickland's crew during his partnership with Chagra, called Jimmy a narcissist who no one really liked. The coke and his increasing gambling problem only made more people begin to see him as a risk instead of an asset. 1977 could be called his last good year, and it was pretty bad compared to the ones before it. For one, he lost a couple of planes along with the weed that they were carrying. But for Chagra and his suppliers, he had a relationship where he would get the product, sell it, and then pay back the people he got it from once he had the money. However, if something was lost through an accident, or if the government captured a shipment, then Jimmy was still responsible for paying for it. But the coke was making him sloppy, and it only fueled his impulsive nature to take chances for the sake of the thrill. His partnership with Jack Strickland and Mike Halliday ended shortly after the Folly Cove shipment, and this year, he was working with a New Orleans-based partner named Henry Wallace. Wallace handled the distribution side in the United States, while Jimmy stuck to his usual role of getting the weed and bringing it into the country. By this point, Jimmy, and by his extension his criminal defense lawyer brothers, were already on law enforcement's radar. Back in 1973, his brother Lee successfully defended a drug smuggler in Tennessee, prompting the bitter police to arrest and charge him with conspiracy to distribute drugs. It almost destroyed his business and reputation, but he challenged the government in court to either provide evidence or drop their charges. And so the charges were dropped. But the DEA was onto Jimmy and how his operation worked. They knew that he would hire private planes and pilots from Vegas to go to the Caribbean to pick up his shipments, so they put trackers on the planes he was suspected of using. But the problem for them was that Jimmy and the pilots knew what they were doing, and they adapted by using 2 planes for their runs when they entered U.S. airspace. The plane with the tracker would be empty, while the plane full of drugs would fly near it. On radar, it looked like one plane. Then the one with the drugs would land to do the delivery, while the tracker plane flew on. When it landed, it would be searched and found empty. But even if Jimmy was able to stay one step ahead of the law, his new partner wasn't. Wallace was arrested that year. He was also known to be an alcoholic and a cokehead, and his bad luck while his partner got away and kept getting richer made him bitter. By the end of the year, he agreed to cooperate against Jimmy Chagra. But for now, Chagra was in the dark about his betrayal. In fact, despite his business headaches, he did end up getting married a 3rd time to a woman named Liz. But just like the other women, married life didn't make him curb his gambling addiction, which only got worse with the cocaine use. He was said to have been getting so sloppy that grifters began to see him as an easy mark they could scam. One story is that he was playing a game of golf against someone else for some serious money. But it was a setup where his rival stationed people on the course disguised as groundskeepers with walkies. Whenever they hit their balls into blind spots, the rivals would always be just a few feet from the hole, while Jimmy's always seemed to land in the trees. Jimmy's recklessness was not only noticed stateside. His Colombian suppliers had also begun to become tired with him and searched for new partners. But despite having a new wife and the wealth to leave the drug game and live comfortably, along with the warning signs that things were changing for the worse, he stuck with his business. A decision he would definitely regret. James Kerr was a relentless prosecutor who was a vicious warrior in America's struggle against drugs. He put a lot of men away, and his new target was the Chagra brothers. Jimmy's flamboyant lifestyle, his partner Wallace flipping, and the other stories they heard about the man with legend status had put him in their crosshairs. But Kerr also believed his lawyer brothers Lee and Joe to be active parts of his operation as well. In fact, Kerr believed that older brother Lee was the real mastermind, while degenerate gambler Jimmy was just a front. In 1978, Kerr officially opened an investigation into the Chagras, and the brothers almost immediately felt it. Lee also liked to gamble, but soon he and Jimmy found themselves cut off from the casinos who refused to let them play because the feds came in asking about them. The noose was tightening against them, and in October of 1978, their brother-in-law, who was married to their sister Patsy, was indicted in a separate drug smuggling case that was tried in a Texas federal court under Judge John Wood. Wood earned himself the nickname of Maximum John because he would always give drug traffickers the maximum sentence, which could be pretty draconian under the 1970 Drug Act, especially if the government made the case that you were a kingpin in the operation. Facing a 30-year sentence if found guilty on all charges, Lee successfully defended his sister's husband and got all but one charge dismissed. He would have more courtroom run-ins with Maximum John and couldn't shake the feeling that the judge personally had it out for him. Then a grand jury was called for in Judge Wood's courtroom that indicted Jimmy. As the Chagras saw it, the government had declared war on them. It was no accident that Kerr chose Judge Wood's court for the prosecution of Jimmy Chagra. The prosecution had a huge range of places where they could have had the trial, but they chose to go with Maximum John because he had a clear bias against drug dealers. Today, this is called judge shopping. Plus, the threat of maximum sentences could get lower-rung members to flip out of fear of spending decades in prison, while those who were guilty could cop a plea deal to avoid a trial. On November 21st, Kerr was walking to his car, and when he opened the door, he accidentally dropped his gloves, causing him to bend down to pick them up. Unknown gunmen opened fire on his car and tore it apart. Had he been standing, he would have been dead. Even luckier for him, the gunmen drove off in a rush and didn't bother to check if they had hit their target. The car was riddled with buckshot and .30 caliber bullets, but Kerr was miraculously unharmed. It was never proven that Jimmy Chagra or his brothers ordered the hit, and the shooters were never caught. Plus, there were no documented cases of Jimmy being violent in the past, despite being a big player in the drug game. While Kerr was actively working the case against Jimmy at the time, he had put a lot of bad people away before this one, which made his enemy list very long. Too long to check through and narrow down. Despite this, he stayed on the case while opting for police protection. But the straw that really broke the camel's back for Jimmy came on December 28th. Lee Chagra's exact involvement in his brother's drug empire was never made fully clear, and he was a working attorney during the late 60s and 1970s. And he did other legal work in addition to criminal defense. Just after Christmas, a potential client got in touch with him to create a will. This was a fairly simple thing to do and would have been easy money to Lee. He agreed to meet the man at his office after hours to quickly help him. After he arrived and let the man in, Lee was shot to death. Lee had a safe in his office that is rumored to have kept up to $400,000 in it. Some rumors claim this money was earmarked for Joe Bonanno, who was now in Arizona to pay him for a drug deal the brothers participated with him on, while others claim it was just petty cash that Lee had to pay off his ever-revolving gambling debts. Whatever the purpose was, Lee was found dead by the door, his office was ransacked, and the money was missing. And without his older brother to keep him grounded, Jimmy's recklessness and cocaine use went off the deep end. He believed that his brother was murdered by the feds. He convinced himself that they did it as revenge for the failed James Kerr assassination attempt. He also started to see Kerr as a lieutenant, with Judge Maximum John Wood as the kingpin of a corrupt law enforcement that would break the rules to take down anyone they deemed to be a bad guy. A police investigation revealed a much different truth. They caught one of the men who murdered Lee, and he flipped on the others. The killers were off-duty soldiers that were hired by the landlord of Lee's office building who had known about all the cash Lee had. But for Jimmy Chagra, this official story was just a cover-up to hide the fact that the government killed him. Jimmy Chagra was a wild man, but without his brother, he became unhinged. He was convinced that he was being hunted by Judge Wood, and that the government was not going to play fair. So he decided that he was going to fight back against them. 1978 was the worst year of Jimmy Chagra's life, and if he thought that 79 would be any better, then he was greatly mistaken. Sure, he was free, but the investigation against him was hurting his business, and that, combined with his ever-increasing recklessness, was turning him into a pariah in the drug smuggling world. And Lee's murder created two major critical wounds for Jimmy. It took away one of the few voices of reason that he actually listened to. Plus, it fueled a lot of hatred in his head against the government, mainly at the man who was going to preside over his eventual trial, Judge John Wood. In the months leading up to his trial, the newlywed Jimmy Chagra did two things. He hired a lawyer named Oscar Goodman, who ended up being one of the best in the business when it came to defending figures from the Vegas scene with organized crime connections, and he let off his steam by gambling and doing coke. It's most likely that one night at the Horseshoe Casino, he was introduced to Charles Harrelson. Neither man ever revealed the exact circumstances of how they met, and since both died in the 2000s, those details have been taken to the grave. Harrelson was a career criminal and professional gambler, who once admitted to being involved in over a dozen murders starting in the 1960s. There's also a rumor that he used to have business cards that advertised himself as a hitman for hire. In addition to gambling, Chagra and Harrelson also had cocaine use in common, except that Jimmy snorted it, while Harrelson is said to have injected it, which is a very unusual method. Once it became spring, the preparations for the government's trial against Jimmy was beginning to get underway, with Kerr accusing Jimmy of being a kingpin of a continuing criminal enterprise. One of Oscar Goodman's first actions as Jimmy's lawyer was to ask Judge Wood to recuse himself based off of derogatory public comments he made about Jimmy, which Goodman claimed would deny his client's right to a fair trial. Judge Wood said no, and the process continued. As they entered May, the jury selection process began. During this time, Judge Wood lived in a condo complex without any personal security. On May 5th, he walked to his wife's car to go to work, where he discovered the tire was flat. Since he was in a rush, he turned and went to their second car to use that one. No one saw what happened next, but there were gunshots causing some neighbors to look out their windows. One saw Maximum John stumble back and fall to the ground, but no one saw his killer, and by the time people went outside, no one was there. Maximum John Wood was a federal judge, and his assassination led to the largest government investigation since JFK. However, after a few days of intense police work, the case appeared cold. But Judge Woods' death did not mean that the state was going to throw out the Chagra trial or even delay it. A new judge, William Sessions, who would later become an FBI director, was assigned to the case, and jury selection continued. Though Sessions ordered that the jury not be made aware about Judge Woods' murder, as it could bias them. But El Paso was a small city, and the assassination was all over the local news, so it would be hard for any of them to be completely unaware of what happened. When the trial began, Oscar Goodman argued that his client was a professional gambler and not a drug dealer. He claimed that the witnesses testifying against him, Jimmy's former partners and employees, were actually just disgruntled gamblers that lost money to him and had an axe to grind. The jury did not agree, and Jimmy Chagra was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison to be served at Leavenworth. Once he was behind bars, he continued his lifestyle of being a reckless gambler. He once lost $43,000 in a high-stakes gin game, and his wife Liz had to deliver the money to someone on the outside. But while Jimmy was now going to spend decades behind bars, the government was not done with him. Given how Judge Wood was overseeing his trial, the feds figured that he had to have been involved with his assassination. So they attacked him with two strategies. One was to secretly record any conversations he had with any visitors. This included his wife and his lawyer brother Joe. They argued in the warrant that the two might be co-conspirators, which excluded them from spousal or attorney-client privilege. Next, they got a fellow prisoner named Jerry Ray James, who was considered a shot caller among the inmates, which meant he was a leader to befriend Jimmy. He did this by indulging Jimmy's delusional fantasies that he could get out of prison early. Meanwhile, as the feds were slowly working on Jimmy Chagra to get him to slip up and confess, the only other possibility for solving Judge Wood's murder would be that an anonymous tip might work out. They received a lot of calls, and they were all bogus, which made investigators approach them with a quickness to disregard them as fast as possible. But one tip that came in actually had some promise. The caller said that a man named Charles Harrelson was involved in the killing. Harrelson used the money he received from Jimmy for the Judge Wood murder to spend the summer of 1979 on a drug and alcohol bender, where he bragged to more than a few people about the murders he committed. So someone decided to send the FBI a tip just in case it was true so they could get a reward. One day in September, he was coked up and driving through the Southwest when his muffler fell out of a bracket and started dragging on the road. He pulled into a gas station and didn't have the tools to remove it. So, with his judgment highly impaired, he tried to shoot it off the car with his gun, but missed and hit a tire. Someone called the police, and they came before he could get away. Harrelson put the gun to his head and threatened to kill himself. There was a 6-hour standoff between him and the cops where he admitted to killing Judge Wood. He also admitted to killing JFK, so the police were a bit skeptical, but he surrendered and went into custody. As he sobered up, he also lawyered up. Since he confessed to Maximum John's murder and did it, there was no turning back. All he wanted to do now was make a deal. He would confess and plead guilty in exchange to do his time in a federal prison and not a Texas state one. He provided investigators with the detail about the flat tire on the judge's car, which was withheld from the public at the time, as proof that he was not lying. Another tip came into the FBI that Harrelson bought a Weatherby Mark V 240 caliber gun 2 weeks before Judge Woods' murder. This weapon used the same type of bullets that killed Maximum John. Next, they tracked down 250 gun dealers in the Southwest who sold this type of gun. From there, they zeroed in on a gun shop in Dallas, where one was purchased 12 days before the murder by a woman who used a fake name. A fingerprint on the contract matched Joanne Harrelson, Charlie's then-wife. Jimmy Chagra also had a false sense of security about what he could say to people. He was using his brother Joe to coordinate drug deals, which confirmed to the authorities that Joe was a criminal, and not a lawyer. He also had conversations between his wife and Joe discussing his drug business and complaining about people who owed him money, but were not paying because he was now behind bars. But most damning for all was that he bragged to prison snitch Jerry Ray James about how he had Judge Wood killed. And he talked to Joe about Harrelson's role in the murder and how they should kill him too, so that any ties to them are severed. Prosecutors charged Harrelson for the murder of Judge Wood, Chagra for commissioning it, his wife Liz for delivering the payment to the assassin, and Joanne Harrelson for helping her husband obtain the gun. They also brought charges against Joe Chagra, who struck a deal with prosecutors that he would testify against Harrelson, but not his brother. In this second trial, Jimmy was once again represented by Oscar Goodman. But without Joe's testimony against his brother, Jimmy Chagra was acquitted of the murder. But he was still in prison for what looked like the rest of his life due to the drug convictions. Harrelson was sentenced to 2 life sentences plus 5 years for his role, and later on died in 2007. His wife Joanne received a 25-year sentence. Joe Chagra was sentenced to 10 years, while Liz Chagra was sentenced to 30 in 1986, at the age of 32. During her trial, the defense was banned from telling the jury that Liz's husband had been acquitted of the murder. If that information was not withheld, then she probably would have walked out of that courtroom a free woman. In the 1990s, Liz was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and Jimmy tried to strike a deal with the government where he would confess to Judge Wood's murder and prosecutor James Kerr's assassination in exchange for his wife's early release so she would not die behind bars. She passed away before the deal could be finalized, and Jimmy recanted his confession. Jimmy's brother Joe served 6 of his 10 years before being released and later died in a car accident. Jimmy Chagra was released from prison in 2003 and lived under the fake name of James Madrid. He remarried in 2005 and lived in a trailer park in Arizona. It was a far world from his $1 million mansion and high-stakes craps games that he enjoyed. He died in 2008.